At my stepson's wake, my daughter-in-law leaned in close enough that only the front row could hear her, and told me the house had never really been mine at all. I didn't raise my voice. I set down my coffee cup, nodded once, and walked out the front door with nothing but my coat. 4 days later, a sheriff's deputy knocked on her door with a folder under his arm. My name is Robert Hensley. Everyone who's known me more than a week just calls me Bob. I'm 64 years old, and for 31 years, I've lived in a two-story colonial on Maple Ridge Road outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Before I tell you what happened on that folding chair at the funeral home, you need to understand the 31 years that came before it. Because a man doesn't get thrown out of his own home in one afternoon. It takes a long time to build a house, and it takes even longer for someone to figure out how to take it from you. If you've ever loved someone more than you trusted your own gut, stay with me to the end of this one. And if stories like this mean something to you, go ahead and hit subscribe, because I've got more of them. I bought the house on Maple Ridge back in 1995. I was 33 years old, working as a machinist at a plant outside the city, and my wife Karen was 6 months pregnant with our son Michael. We didn't have a dime to spare that first year. I remember eating soup out of the same pot 3 nights running just to make the mortgage payment on time. But Karen never once complained. She hung curtains, she'd sewn herself in the kitchen window, and every spring she'd get down on her knees in the dirt out back and plant tomatoes in the same 6-foot patch of soil, year after year, like it was a promise she was renewing. I built a shed with my own hands the summer Michael turned 5, mostly so I'd have somewhere quiet to go when the house got loud with a growing boy's noise. That shed is still standing. I still go out there most mornings with my coffee. Karen passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, gone within 8 months of the day we found out. I won't spend long on that part because some griefs you don't get through by talking about them. You just carry them. And I've carried mine as well as any man can. After she was gone, the house got quiet in a way I wasn't prepared for. Michael was 31 at the time, living 40 minutes away in an apartment with his girlfriend, a woman named Renee Castillo. He came by more often after his mother died, checking on me, bringing groceries I didn't need, sitting with me on the back porch some evenings without saying much of anything. I was grateful for it. A man my age living alone in a big house can start to feel like a ghost in his own life, and Michael's visits kept me tethered to something. About 2 years after Karen passed, Michael and Renee got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Lancaster. I walked around that reception with a smile plastered on my face, because it was the right thing to do. But there was a part of me that ached, watching my son start a new chapter without his mother there to see it. 6 months into the marriage, Michael sat me down at my own kitchen table and told me he and Renee wanted to move in with me. He said it was so Renee could help around the house, so I wouldn't be alone so much, so we could split the bills 3 ways instead of me carrying it all myself on a pension that wasn't getting any bigger. I told him I didn't need looking after. He told me he wasn't asking because I needed it. He was asking because he wanted his father close. I believed him. I still believe he meant it, at least at first. I should tell you now, because I didn't understand it then, that the signs were there from almost the very first month. Renee was 30 years old when she moved into my house, a woman who worked in marketing for a company downtown, always dressed sharp, always polished, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make you feel like she'd already decided something about you before you opened your mouth. She was pleasant enough to my face, complimented my cooking, asked about Karen sometimes in a way that seemed thoughtful. But within the first few months, Karen's sewing curtains came down from the kitchen window without so much as a conversation about it, replaced with something gray and modern that Renee said opened the room up. The garden out back, the one Karen had knelt in every spring for 25 years, got paved over for a patio before I'd even fully processed that it was happening. I told myself I was being an old man, clinging to things that didn't matter anymore. I told myself Michael was happy, and that mattered more than curtains and tomato plants. But I noticed things, the way you notice a draft in a house, even when you can't find where it's coming from. I noticed how Renee referred to our house at dinner parties with her friends, never once correcting herself. I noticed how she'd ask Michael, in that light, breezy voice she used when she wanted something, why the deed was still just in my name after all these years. Wasn't that a little old-fashioned? Didn't he want to be protected too? I noticed she started handling more and more of my mail, said she was just trying to help an old man keep organized, and I let her, because arguing about mail felt petty and small. My son worked long hours as a claims manager for an insurance company, and every evening he came home more tired than the last, quieter than he used to be. nodding along at dinner instead of laughing the way he laughed as a boy. I never said a word against Renee to him. Not once. A father doesn't put that weight on his son's shoulders when the son is already carrying so much. But I saw him shrinking, month by month, and I told myself it was just marriage, just the natural settling of two young people learning to live together. I was wrong to stay quiet as long as I did. I loved my son more than I trusted my own eyes, and at the time, that felt like the only decent choice available to me. About 5 months before everything changed, Michael showed up at the house on a Sunday afternoon while Renee was at a work retreat 2 states away. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table he'd done his algebra homework at as a boy, and he had a look on his face I hadn't seen since he was 17 and had wrecked my truck without telling me for 2 days. He slid a thick envelope across the table, sealed, and told me to put it somewhere Renee would never think to look. I asked him what was going on. He said, "Dad, I need you to trust me and not ask me anything else right now. If something ever happens to me, this is the first thing you open." I laughed it off, told him he was being dramatic, that a healthy 34-year-old man wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He didn't laugh with me. He just looked at me steady and serious and said, "Just promise me." I promised. I took that envelope out to the shed and locked it inside an old army footlocker that had been my father's, buried under a stack of Karen's gardening magazines nobody would ever think to dig through. I didn't ask more questions because my son looked like a man who'd already made peace with something heavy, and I trusted him enough not to make him say it out loud. Looking back now, I wonder how long he'd known something was wrong before he ever came to that kitchen table. I wonder how many nights he lay awake next to Renee, quietly building a case to protect his father in case he wasn't around to do it himself. That envelope sat in the shed for 5 months. I didn't think about it every day, but some nights I'd look out the kitchen window at that little building in the dark and feel a strange, low hum of unease I couldn't explain. It was a Thursday night in late February when the call came. Michael had been driving home from a late meeting on Route 22 when a truck crossed the center line on a curve outside Hershey and hit his car head on. The state trooper who called said he didn't make it to the hospital. I was standing in my own kitchen when my phone rang, the same kitchen where Karen used to hum while she cooked, and I don't remember my legs holding me up, but somehow they did. Renee was upstairs when the call came. I remember her running down in her socks, grabbing the phone out of my hand to hear it for herself, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw something crack open in her face that looked like real grief, and it made the whole thing feel almost bearable, like we were two people who had lost the same thing and could lean on each other because of it. The days after are mostly fog to me now. Phone calls to a funeral home in Harrisburg, choosing a casket while barely able to read the price sheet in front of me, calling Karen's sister in Ohio, calling Michael's old friends from high school, most of whom I hadn't spoken to in 15 years. Renee took the lead on most of the arrangements, and at the time I was thankful, because some mornings I couldn't manage to get my shoes on the right feet, let alone plan a funeral. I kept catching myself listening for his truck in the driveway. I set his coffee mug out one morning before I remembered. Losing Karen had nearly broken me. Losing Michael felt like losing the last living piece of the family the two of us had built. I sat in his old bedroom one night, surrounded by trophies from a Little League season 25 years gone, and I cried the kind of crying that doesn't make a sound after a while. It just empties you out. I had no idea that within a week, the woman helping me pick out flowers for my son's casket would be the one standing in my own living room, telling me I didn't belong there anymore. The service was held on a gray Tuesday morning at St. Andrew's, the church where Michael had been baptized 34 years earlier. Close to 90 people came. Co-workers from his office, old teammates from his high school baseball days, half the street I'd lived on for 3 decades. I stood near the casket in a suit I hadn't worn since Karen's funeral, shaking hands, accepting hugs from faces I hadn't seen in years, nodding at things people said that I couldn't remember 5 seconds later. Renee stood beside me through the whole service, dressed in black, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the grieving widow the way you'd expect from someone who'd rehearsed it. After the burial, everyone gathered back at the house, the same reception tradition we'd followed when Karen died. I was sitting in my own recliner, in the corner of the living room, still in my funeral clothes, a paper plate of food someone had handed me sitting untouched on my knee. When Renee crouched down beside my chair with a mug of coffee, the room was full, maybe 25 or 30 people, standing in small clusters, holding plates in quiet conversation. She leaned in close to my ear, close enough that I could smell her perfume, and said, in a voice pitched just loud enough for the people nearest us to catch every word, "This was never really your house, Bob." Not once Michael and I got married. You need to stop crying and start figuring out where you're actually going to live. The room went dead quiet around us. I saw my neighbor of almost 20 years, a man named Gerald Whitfield, freeze mid-bite with a deviled egg halfway to his mouth. I saw Michael's old high school baseball coach, a heavy-set man named Coach Ruiz, go pale near the fireplace. Every soul in that living room heard her say those words. On the day I buried my only son, in the house I had lived in for 31 years. I did not shout. I did not stand up and argue with her in front of the people who just watched me bury my child. Something in me went very still, the way a lake goes still and glassy right before the first real frost sets in. I thought about Michael. I thought about that envelope, locked in the footlocker out in the shed. I thought about 5 months of trusting my son without ever asking him what he was protecting me from. I looked at Renee for a long moment, long enough that she started to shift her weight like she wasn't sure what was coming. And then I set my coffee cup down on the side table, nice and slow, and I said, "All right, just those 2 words. Nothing else." The room stayed frozen a few seconds longer before people started drifting back into their quiet conversations, unsure what they'd just watched. I stood up, walked upstairs, and put a change of clothes, my blood pressure medication, and a photograph of Karen and Michael from a 4th of July barbecue years back into a duffel bag. Then I walked back downstairs, out the side door, across the yard, and into the shed. I dug Karen's gardening magazines out of the footlocker and pulled the envelope Michael had given me out from underneath them. I put it in the duffel bag with everything else, walked out of the shed and out of my own yard without going back through the house at all. Renee never saw me leave. I imagine she assumed I'd gone up to sulk in my room. I walked 3 houses down and knocked on Gerald Whitfield's door. Gerald had lived 2 doors down from me for almost 20 years, ever since he retired from the Postal Service and moved in with his wife, Donna. He was 68, a lean, quiet man who still climbed onto his own roof to clear the gutters every October against his cardiologist's advice. He'd been at the funeral that day and had heard every word Renee said in that living room. When he opened his door and saw me standing on his porch with a duffel bag over my shoulder, he didn't ask a single question. He just stepped back and said, "Get in here, Bob. It's cold out." Donna had the guest room made up before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee at their kitchen table. Gerald sat across from me, poured 2 mugs, and slid one over. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. I told him everything. What she'd said, the way she'd said it, the way her face had looked almost satisfied delivering it. Gerald shook his head slow, jaw tight. "That's your house, Bob," he said. "Deed's been in your name since before Michael was even born. She's got no more right to that house than I do." I nodded, but my mind wasn't fully on the legal side of things yet. My mind was on the envelope sitting in my bag, the one Michael told me to open first if anything ever happened. That night, after Gerald and Donna had gone to bed, I sat alone at their kitchen table under a small reading lamp and finally opened it. Inside were 4 things that rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last 5 months of my son's life. The first was a copy of the deed to my own house, confirming exactly what Gerald had told me, that the property had never been transferred to Michael or Renee in any form, that it had sat in my name alone since the day I signed the mortgage papers in 1995. The second was a printed statement from Michael's life insurance policy through his employer, a policy worth $425,000. 4 months before he died, Michael had quietly changed the beneficiary from Renee to me. The third was a folder of bank statements he'd printed and highlighted himself, showing withdrawals from their joint savings account, nearly $40,000 over 8 months, moved into an account with Renee's name only on it. An account Michael said he only discovered by accident when a bounced automatic payment forced him to go digging through their finances. The fourth was a handwritten letter, 4 pages, in Michael's own uneven handwriting. In it, he wrote that he'd started noticing things almost a year into the marriage. Renee asking pointed questions about my age, my health, whether I had a will. Renee suggesting, more than once, that it might be smart for Michael to talk to me about getting ahead of things and having the house put in both their names, for my own protection, she said, in case something happened to me and there was a mess with probate. He wrote that he'd caught her once, on her laptop, drafting an email to a real estate agent asking about listing prices for homes on Maple Ridge Road, 6 months before either of us had said a single word about selling anything. He wrote that he'd confronted her about the missing money, and she'd cried and promised to stop, and he'd wanted to believe her, but some part of him no longer did. He wrote that he loved her, or had loved her, but that he wasn't a fool, and he wasn't going to let his father get pushed out of his own home to pay for whatever hole she dug for herself. He wrote that he'd already met with a lawyer about filing for divorce quietly, once he had enough documented, and that he was scared of what she might do if she found out before he was ready. The last line of the letter said, "Dad, if you're reading this, something happened before I could finish protecting you the way I wanted to. Please, don't let her win this. I love you." I read that letter 3 times at Gerald's kitchen table, and I wasn't crying from grief anymore by the third time through. Something else had settled into my chest alongside the grief, something clearer and harder. The next morning, while I was still at Gerald's eating breakfast I couldn't taste, Renee was already moving fast back at my house. Donna, who'd walked over to check the mail for me, called up to say she'd seen a moving company's flatbed truck parked in my driveway and a woman in a blazer pinning a real estate sign into the front lawn. The sign had a photo of my house on it and the words "Coming Soon" printed across the top in bold red letters. Renee was preparing to sell my house less than 48 hours after burying her husband, and less than a full day after telling me to my face that it had never been mine. What she didn't know was that Michael's letter had already told me exactly where to look. That same morning, I called an old friend of Karen's family, a real estate attorney in Harrisburg named Walter Pruitt, who'd known Michael since he was in diapers and had handled our closing on the house back in 1995. I told him everything, start to finish: the funeral, the words in the living room, the envelope, the moving truck, already sitting in my driveway. Walter told me to sit tight, and within 2 hours he called back with something that made my stomach drop clean through the floor. He'd pulled the Dauphin County Recorder's records that morning and found a quitclaim deed filed just 4 days earlier, supposedly signed by Michael, transferring full ownership of my house from me to Renee. The problem, Walter said, was that according to Michael's own company travel records, which Walter had also managed to get a look at through a contact, Michael had been at a 3-day claims conference in Pittsburgh on the exact date the notary stamp on that deed claimed he'd signed it in Harrisburg. Walter didn't waste any time once he found that document. He'd been practicing law long enough to know forged paperwork when he saw it. He pulled the license number of the notary listed on the deed, a woman named Diane Kowalski, and made a call to the county's notary oversight office. Within a day, they confirmed Kowalski had no record on file of ever notarizing anything for Michael Hensley on that date or any other. Walter suspected, and later confirmed through the investigation that followed, that Renee had paid Kowalski, a former college roommate she'd stayed loosely in touch with over the years, to forge the notarization using an old, unretired notary stamp Kowalski still had sitting in a drawer somewhere. Walter sat me down and explained, plainly, that this had stopped being a family dispute the moment that deed was filed. This was deed fraud and forgery, both third-degree felonies under Pennsylvania law, both carrying real prison time. He asked me one question, straight, no cushioning. "Bob, do you want to handle this quiet, or do you want to report it?" I thought about Michael. I thought about that letter in his own handwriting, about the months he'd spent quietly building a case to protect a father he loved, all while sitting across the dinner table from the woman he suspected was already planning his replacement. I thought about Renee kneeling by my recliner, close enough to smell her perfume, telling me to stop crying over my own son. I looked at Walter and said, "Report every bit of it." Walter filed a formal fraud complaint with the Dauphin County Recorder of Deeds that same afternoon, attaching copies of the forged deed, the notary's sworn statement denying any record of the transaction, and Michael's original letter as supporting evidence. By early evening, the file had been forwarded to the Dauphin County District Attorney's Financial Crimes Division. The detective assigned was a 22-year veteran named Detective Carol Amato, a woman with a reputation, Walter told me, for not letting a single loose thread go unpulled. Walter met with her personally that evening and walked her through the whole timeline: the funeral, the eviction demand made in front of nearly 30 witnesses, the moving truck, the forged deed filed while Michael's body was still at the funeral home. Detective Amato pulled Michael's actual conference registration and hotel records from the Pittsburgh trip that same night, confirming beyond any doubt that he'd been checked into a Marriott 200 miles away on the date the deed claimed he'd signed paperwork in Harrisburg. She also reached out to the real estate agent who'd planted the sign in my yard, a woman named Sheila Ortiz, who had absolutely no idea the listing she was preparing carried a fraudulent ownership claim underneath it. Sheila pulled the sign from my lawn herself the next morning and canceled every bit of the paperwork the moment Amato explained the situation. Detective Amato told Walter that between the forged notary stamp, the impossible travel timeline, and Michael's own handwritten letter laying out Renee's financial behavior in detail, she had more than enough to move fast. She also mentioned that Renee had already attempted to file an early claim with Michael's life insurance company that same week, listing herself as sole beneficiary, apparently unaware the policy had been legally changed 4 months earlier. That attempted claim alone had already tripped an internal fraud flag with the insurance company before Amato's investigation ever reached them, meaning two separate systems were closing in on Renee at once, each one built out of steps Michael had quietly taken months before he ever knew he'd need them. 4 days after the funeral, right around 7:15 in the morning, a Dauphin County Sheriff's cruiser pulled into the driveway of my house on Maple Ridge Road. Donna told me later, because Gerald had walked over to watch from the sidewalk, that Renee answered the door in a bathrobe, half asleep, confused. Detective Amato identified herself and told Renee she was investigating a formal complaint of deed fraud and forgery connected to the property, and that she had a number of questions about a notarized document filed with the county recorder's office the week before. Renee tried to explain that Michael had signed the paperwork before he died. Amato, according to Donna, answered calmly that Michael had been 200 miles away in Pittsburgh on the date in question, a fact she could confirm through his employer's own records anytime Renee wanted to see them. Renee's face, Donna said, went the color of the porch railing. Renee was brought in for formal questioning that same day, along with Diane Kowalski, the notary who'd forged the stamp. Within 9 days, both women were formally charged, Renee with deed fraud, forgery, and attempted insurance fraud, Kowalski with forgery and notary misconduct. The forged deed was voided by the county recorder the moment the fraud was confirmed, and full, clear ownership of the house was restored to my name, exactly where it had legally sat the whole time. Renee was ordered to vacate the property within 7 days, while the criminal case moved forward. The same house she'd told me, over my son's own funeral, coffee, and cake, had never really been mine. Gerald told me later that when the moving truck finally showed up for her belongings, not one neighbor came out to help carry a single box. A few stood on their porches and watched. I moved back into the house on Maple Ridge Road on a cold, bright afternoon in early April, a little over 5 weeks after I'd walked out the side door with nothing but a duffel bag and an envelope hidden under gardening magazines. Gerald and Donna helped me carry my things back in, and Donna left a casserole warming on the stove before she went home that night, the same kind of quiet decency this street has always run on. The house felt different, walking back into it, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with the furniture, and I don't think that particular ache is ever going to fully leave. I found Karen's old sewing machine still boxed up in the basement, where Renee had shoved it 2 years earlier, and I carried it upstairs myself and set it back up in the spare tomb, right by the window, where the afternoon light hits it just the way she liked. Renee eventually took a plea deal on the fraud and forgery charges, avoiding the maximum sentence the DA's office had originally pushed for. But she didn't walk away clean the way she'd clearly expected to. She was sentenced to 14 months in the county correctional facility, followed by 3 years of probation, along with a court order to repay every legal cost tied to the fraudulent claim. Kowalski received probation and lost her notary license permanently. Renee never once tried to contact me after that morning. The deputy showed up at her door, and I never reached out to her either. There wasn't anything left to say. Some evenings I still sit out in the shed with my coffee, in the same folding chair I've had since Michael was a boy, and I think about my son. I think about how, even while he was carrying his own fear, even while he was sitting across the dinner table from a woman he no longer fully trusted, he spent 5 quiet months building a wall around his father, one document at a time, so that if the worst ever happened, I wouldn't be left standing in the wreckage with nothing. That envelope in the footlocker wasn't just paperwork. It was the last thing my son ever gave me, and it turned out to be the most important gift of his whole life. I lost my boy, and there's no getting that back. Not ever. But I got to keep the house we built our family in, and more than that, I got to keep the truth of exactly who my son was, right up until the very last thing he ever did for me. If this one meant something to you, go ahead and hit that like button, and stick around, because I've got plenty more stories like it.